Hello and welcome to today's episode of the International Daily Roundup by People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the top stories from around the world. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Argentines protest IMF debt restructuring plans. Turkish workers reject rising costs and poverty. Poor and indigenous peoples face growing violence in Brazil, says report. And pandemic health costs push 500 million into poverty. In our first story, thousands of people took to the streets of Buenos Aires on December 11th to protest the International Monetary Fund. The action took place amid negotiations between the Argentinian government and the IMF to restructure a $44 billion debt. The amount was part of the $57 billion loan agreement signed by former President Mauricio Macri in 2018. At the time, the government also enforced drastic austerity measures. After President Alberto Fernandez took office in 2020, he refused the rest of the loan and wanted to renegotiate the terms of repayment. Under the original terms, Argentina would have to pay back $19 billion in 2022 and 2023 each. The Fernandez government stated that the country could not afford these payments and that it would not compromise Argentina's future over this debt. The country's inflation reached 41.8% between January and October, and prices have increased by 52% in the last 12 months. Over 40% of the population is living below the poverty line. The protest in Buenos Aires was held against any restructuring deal between the state and the IMF. Over 100 student organizations, trade unions, left-wing movements, and environmental and rights groups participated in the action. They argued that billions had been used to finance capital outflows instead of addressing socio-economic and infrastructural issues. Protesters chanted, "No payment of debt, no IMF," on Saturday, denouncing the debt as illegitimate and fraudulent. They also rejected adjustment measures and argued that the burden of debt was on people who were already suffering the economic impact of COVID-19. Protesters gathered outside the Plaza de Mayo and urged the government not to recognize the debt and to redirect funds to budgets for health, education, and housing. Next, we go to Turkey, where a massive workers' rally was held in Istanbul on December 12th. Thousands of people gathered in Kartal Square under the slogan, "Enough is enough, we want to make a living." The protest action was organized by the Confederation of Revolutionary Trade Unions of Turkey, or DISK. Public sector and health workers, students, and retirees denounced the economic policies of the conservative Erdogan government. They also demanded that the minimum wage be at least 5,200 Turkish lira from 2022. Protesters spoke out against debt, poverty, hunger, and unemployment during Sunday's rally. According to a survey conducted in May, Turkey's official line of starvation for a four-member family was 2,825 liras. The current minimum wage lies below the line at only 2,800 liras. Meanwhile, the inflation rate has hit 21% and the value of the lira has fallen by around 50% in 2021. DISC has also stated that while the global average minimum wage is between $385 to $390, it has fallen to $280 in Turkey. Protesters declared on Sunday that the Turkish working class and the country were not for sale and that victory would belong to the workers who resist. They demanded justice in income and a humane life and wage, stating that they would not surrender to misery. Organizations including the Communist Party of Turkey, the Workers' Party, and the Socialist Workers' Party also participated in the protest. We now take a look at a report by Brazil's Pastoral Land Commission, which has documented a drastic increase in violence against indigenous, poor, and rural communities. Between January and August 2021, 418 territories witnessed destruction of houses, expulsions, and land grabbing through false documents. There were also cases of attacks by hitmen and restrictions on access to collective use of land. Out of the 418 territories, 28% were indigenous, 23% belonged to the Afro-Brazilian Quilombola people, and 26 murders were recorded in the countryside between January and November 2021. These murders were those which result from hitmen, landowners, illegal miners, and others. As reported by Brazil de Fato, deaths due to the ongoing conflicts increased by over 1,000%. This refers to deaths in cases where conflicts and lack of public policies disrupt access to basic rights like healthcare and education. Out of the 103 such deaths recorded this year, 101 were of the indigenous Yanomami peoples. The Yanomami Reserve has been repeatedly invaded and attacked, with over 20,000 illegal miners currently present in the area. The Pastoral Land Commission has highlighted factors including structural racism and dismantling of key agencies which contribute to ongoing violence. Obstacles to accessing land of collective use increased by 1,057% in 2021. Expulsions of people from land also grew by 157%. This increase coincided with a rise in housing and insecurity across Brazil during the pandemic. As reported by Brazil de Fato, the number of families surviving on occupied land increased by 558% during the pandemic. And for our final story, we look at two reports by the World Bank and the WHO on pandemic-related poverty. 500 million people worldwide were pushed into extreme poverty due to healthcare costs related to COVID-19. The pandemic also triggered the worst economic crisis since the 1930s, making it even more difficult to pay for care. The disruption and strain on health services led to a drop in immunization coverage for the first time in 10 years. As a result, 23 million children lost out on life-saving vaccines. In 2019, 68% of the world's population had been covered by essential health services. These included reproductive and pre- and postnatal care, immunization, and treatment for diseases like HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis. Deaths from TB and malaria increased in 2020. Moreover, the provision of services did not ensure affordability, which left poor communities even more vulnerable. Even before 2020, almost 1 billion people were spending over 10% of their household budget on health alone. Moreover, 90% of all households incurring impoverishment due to out-of-pocket healthcare costs were already at or below the poverty line. The WHO and World Bank have stated that the pandemic halted and even reversed the progress made in universalized health care coverage over the past 20 years. Moreover, the reported numbers are based on pre-pandemic data, with current figures expected to be much higher. And that's all for today. For more such stories, visit our website at www.peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you.
So the Premier Center is an arena in one of the Dakotas. I forget which one. I think North Dakota, but I could be wrong on that. And there was a hockey game there, Stampede game. I think this is minor league hockey. I'm not totally sure, but I think that's what it is. And after the first period, they had a bunch of local teachers come on the ice, and they participated in the first ever Dash for Cash. So teachers had to scramble and fight for $5,000 in dollar bills. And they were trying to get as many dollar bills as possible so they can afford for their kids supplies. Take a look at this. I think the most disturbing thing about this to me is that not everybody is disturbed by it. there was some local reporter who was tweeting about it and was sort of like jovial and casually, nonchalantly explaining it and saying, teachers are going to get some supplies for their kiddos. Hooray! This is dystopian nightmare stuff here, man. This is fail state stuff. You have a bunch of teachers on their hands and knees scrambling for dollar bills to afford supplies for their kids. Why doesn't everybody look at this as just a complete and utter moral and ethical failing on the part of society? There's a number of like little thought experiments you could do to put this in context. Imagine we did this with cops. Imagine we had police officers down there like, look, we know your departments are underfunded, but you can scramble for the cash and grab as many dollar bills as you can, and then you can buy some more gear. You know, maybe you'll even get like a hockey goalie mask, and that might protect you from bullets and whatnot. Some hockey goalie pads. Look, we're just trying to help you. I mean, this is better for you, right? You're going to get more cash out of it. You're going to get more gear as a result of it. This is like Hunger Games stuff, bro. What are we talking about here? Now, compare this picture with what we know about the consolidation of the U.S. economy during COVID, how billionaires have made trillions more and everybody else is struggling. I oftentimes think about that Rand Corporation study, which found that over the course of just a few decades, so like the post-World War II period until today, the top 1% has effectively stolen $47 trillion from the bottom 90%. And actually now that number's over 50 trillion because this article came out like a couple years ago. And what they say is if you just kept the income disparity and the wealth disparity that existed right after World War II, if you just keep that disparity, that ratio moving forward, what happens is every person in the bottom 90% would have $1,144 more per month, every month for the rest of their lives. So there's your UBI right there. Your UBI was basically stolen from you because the owner class rigged the rules, rigged the game, and kept more of the income for themselves. Look, and it all comes back to corruption. The story always comes back to corruption. They give money to the politicians turn around and do them favors, give them subsidies, give them tax cuts, and have, anti-worker policies, anti-bottom 90% or 99% policies. So this is where we are now. We're not even, you have the debate going on in the Senate where Joe Manchin was like, I don't want to raise the corporate tax rate. I think that, we need to be competitive around the world. And then they were like, well, maybe a billionaire's tax. And then, or no, it was Kyrsten Sinema who didn't want to raise the corporate tax rate. And then it was Manchin when Sinema floated the billionaire's tax with the other Democrats. That's one she apparently would have gotten on board with. Joe Manchin was like, I don't want to do billionaire's tax. We're singling out individuals. So no corporate tax increase, no billionaire tax increase, no top marginal tax increase hike. And look at what's going on at the state and local level. Now, granted, schools are funded with more local taxes than they are at the federal level, but it still illustrates a good picture of what this country's like. That people in the top 1%, the owner class, the corporations, the billionaires, they always win. And then this is what actual real people are dealing with. Let's scramble for cash. Look, get the money so you can get some supplies. How about you just fund the schools fully so that they can have supplies? How about every teacher in this country should make 6 figures? How about that? I mean, it is kind of amazing, isn't it? It does speak a lot about the values that our society has when, the market makes it so that certain things might be a real skill and really important, and they get paid relatively well. So, like a surgeon, for example, certain kinds of doctors. But then there are other things that are probably equally important that just don't have that high value because the way the market system works, there's just not as much value put on them, and more people can do that job, so they pay them less. But we can decide, we can choose as a society, with the commons, with the public in mind, we can choose to venerate teachers and to have them paid phenomenally well, and to understand that this is like a very noble and important job where they help shape the minds of the children for the next generation. I mean, in a world that made sense, teachers would make, I think Bernie had some proposal. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think his proposal was like they need to make at least like $70,000 a year or something like that. He's right. Now, I get it. $70,000 is a lot in like rural Wyoming, but shit, I'm more than happy to have my tax money, even if you take it at the federal level. I'm more than happy to subsidize teachers. That's way better than spending money to bomb our 9th country, or keep our 900 military bases around the world, or bail out Wall Street again. So, man, this is dystopian stuff. Again, the most disturbing part to me is that not everybody's disturbed by it. That we've grown such a thick skin and we're so callous that we just look at this like, yeah, this is the stuff we do. Like, oh, look, a fun game in between periods at a hockey game. Hooray. Man. It's really a broken system, and this is a very clear illustration of it here. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to. So, there was a Trump memo, a White House memo, that was just released as part of this January 6th commission. Now, listen, I've been clear with my position on that from up front. I largely think it's a waste of time. I know that that's a controversial take in left circles, but let me explain. The reason why it's largely a waste of time is because we already know what happened. I mean, the goddamn thing is on video. So we know what happened. We know who's guilty. We know who deserves charges. And those people are being charged. Now, I don't want Patriot Act 2.0 to strip away people's civil liberties and to destroy the Constitution further. I want to repeal the original Patriot Act, which was abused in 1,000 different ways and did destroy the Constitution in many respects. So repeal the original Patriot Act, don't do another Patriot Act, and don't give the U.S. intelligence agencies and the deep state, for lack of a better term, more money, more funding, so they can continue to lie and they can continue to mislead us and they can continue to enact an agenda that is very unpopular and continue a new Cold War and things of that nature. So that's why I thought the January 6th thing was, it's theater for the public. It's a way, and by the way, Joe Manchin actually admitted this. There was a great article on this where he said, I think it was over the January 6th commission, he says, listen, we got to give the Democratic base some sort of symbolic victory so that we don't have to do any of the substantive policies that improve everybody's life. So why not just, come on, he was trying to get Republicans, just come on board, let's do this January 6th thing, and then we could have the theater and the left get satiated because Democrats can scold Republicans and say, oh, you're so bad. And then, the eyes off the ball, and people aren't talking about universal child care. People aren't talking about pre-K. People aren't talking about expanding Medicare. People aren't talking about any of the substantive policy changes as part of Build Back Better. This was like the strategy of corrupt corporate Democrats to try to, get the left to pay attention to the theater as opposed to the substance. Okay, so the January 6th thing, we have it on video. We know who's guilty. You don't need an investigation. The investigation is watching the videos and going, that person's guilty. Let's find them and let's lock them up because they committed crimes. Okay. Well, there is one respect in which I was incorrect about the January 6th commission. I thought, well, nothing else is going to come out of this. We already know what happened. Well, turns out there is one thing that came out of this. Namely, we got this memo which shows the conversations that were being had in the White House around the time. And Mark Meadows, who was Trump's chief of staff at the time, submitted this email to the January 6th committee. And look at what it said in the email. It was a PowerPoint slide. Options for January 6th. VP Pence seats Republican electors over the objections of Democrats in states where fraud, so-called fraud, occurred. VP Pence rejects the electors from states where fraud occurred, causing the election to be decided by remaining electoral votes. VP Pence delays the decision in order to allow for a vetting and subsequent counting of all the legal paper ballots. So this is them saying on January 6th, have Mike Pence block Biden being approved and certified as president of the United States. And these are the options they're giving him for this. Okay, but I have more. Recommendations. Brief senators and congressmen on foreign interference in the election. So in other words, do the Hillary Clinton trick and say, instead of saying Russia, say it was Venezuela rigged the election. And so now we're going to brief Republican senators and congressmen and say there was foreign interference, so you can't approve Biden as president. Declare national security emergency. So in other words, block Biden from becoming president by just declaring there's a national security emergency, so Trump needs to stay in office and delay approving Biden. Foreign influence and control of electronic voting systems. Declare electronic voting in all states invalid. Throw out all electronic voting. I think what they were actually trying to say is all mail-in voting, but they wrote electronic. But either way, they're trying to say just don't count the votes that we don't like because certain types of votes went overwhelmingly Democratic. So just exclude those and say, well, that we think they're fraudulent. This is insanity. Legal and genuine paper ballot counts or constitutional remedy delegated to Congress. So these are the recommendations that they're giving Donald Trump about January 6th. And what they boil down to is Mike Pence can and should block the seating of Joe Biden. Here are the ways in which we think he can do that. And here are the ways in which we think you, Mr. President, can take the initiative and you can say we're delaying Joe Biden becoming president. And the scariest ones here are just declare all electronic voting in all states invalid. Nah, they went to Biden, so therefore we think they're illegitimate. They're fraudulent, so we're just going to throw them out. This is how atrocities happen, guys. It's the entire time as you are doing the immoral, unethical, illegal act, you vociferously accuse the other side. They're the ones who are doing it, and we need to just remedy it by doing our tyrannical thing here. That's what this is. Declare a national security emergency? So in other words, they wanted Trump. Mark Meadows was casually floating the idea of Trump going out there saying, there are a lot of questions around this election. We already know that. We've seen all the talk. We know all the problems. We know it's not a legitimate election. Therefore, time to declare a national security emergency until we figure out what the hell is going on. And so I'm delaying Joe Biden being seated as president of the United States of America. This was openly being discussed behind the scenes. We dodged a massive bullet because Mike Pence, for all of his flaws, thought, listen, I can't go up there in a largely symbolic meeting and be like, I'm not allowing Joe Biden to be seated as president. He didn't have the balls to do that. For all of his flaws, he at least did the bare minimum of let's transition power. And the other reason we dodged the bullet is because Trump, honestly, he was just too much of a pussy to follow through on it. He probably felt like, well, what happens if they push back? What happens if I get dragged out of the office in handcuffs or whatever? And so he backed off of it. But these things were being openly discussed. There are literal memos about how you can override a Democratic election and therefore commit what? Do a coup. This would have been a coup. And I don't want to hear anybody who's silly enough to still buy into the conspiracy theories. You're just wrong. I don't know how else to say it. I'll be as straightforward as possible. We've had over 60 court cases. Donald Trump and his team lost almost every single one. They only won one case, and that one case was over some procedural bullshit, which wouldn't have changed the outcome of the election and wouldn't have changed the outcome of the state. You had the Arizona audit, which was supposed to be the linchpin of see, we'll prove that there was fraud here. Joe Biden increased his vote count in the Arizona audit. You have Trump-appointed judges who looked at the evidence and laughed it out of court and said, there's no fraud here. They were this close to trying to do a coup. It's just the fact that Mike Pence had a single shred of integrity to do the right thing and approve the result, and Donald Trump is too much of a bitch to put his neck out there on his own. But look, it's scary because it shows you how much our so-called institutions, which are already shredded in 1,000 different ways, it shows you how they're just illusory. You know, they function on the goodwill of the people to continue to do the kabuki theater. And so virtually every president to this point has been like, yeah, all right, I lost, whatever, moving on. But a thin-skinned person with a dictatorial instinct, we were that close to that not happening. And this end of democracy type stuff here. So really, thank our lucky stars that we barely got out of this one as bad as it was. I mean, January 6th was terrible. The riot was terrible. It could have been a lot worse based on how rabid Trump's most hardcore believers are and based on how thin-skinned Trump is and how petty and narcissistic he is. It actually could have went a lot worse. But I will say this does not bode well for the future of American democracy. It really doesn't, because if we're already at this unstable point, well, Trump just spawned 1,000 different Trump clones moving forward. And at some point, one of them probably get elected in the U.S. as a Republican down the road. And what happens when we come across a guy who isn't as big of a pussy? What happens then? Tell you what happens. It gets even uglier. So there's a wake-up call for a lot of people, man, that's for sure. And we were this close. This close. Memos openly discussing a coup. And, you know, really sort of cloaking it in the legal language of, like, serious people talk, you know? And I think they might even be silly enough to believe their own, like, serious person legal talk. So they wouldn't even think of it as, like, we're doing a coup. Some of them would, but a lot of them don't. They think, no, we're righting a wrong here. We're righting an injustice of Biden stealing the election or whatever. Very, very, very unstable political situation in the U.S. right now, needless to say.
Okay, fun segment. Chris Wallace shocked us all. He's leaving Fox News. Here was his announcement yesterday at the end of the show. Let's take a listen.
After 18 years, this is my final Fox News Sunday. It is the last time, and I say this with real sadness, we will meet like this. 18 years ago, the bosses here at Fox promised me they would never interfere with a guest I booked or a question I asked, and they kept that promise. I have been free to report to the best of my ability, to cover the stories I think are important, to hold our country's leaders to account. It's been a great ride. We've covered 5 presidential elections, interviewed every president since George H.W. Bush, traveled the world sitting down with France's Emmanuel Macron and Russia's Vladimir Putin. And I've gotten to spend Sunday mornings with you. It may sound corny, but I feel we've built a community here. There's a lot you can do on Sunday mornings. The fact you've chosen to spend this hour with us is something I cherish. But after 18 years, I have decided to leave Fox. I want to try something new, to go beyond politics to all the things I'm interested in. I'm ready for a new adventure, and I hope you'll check it out. And so, for the last time, dear friends.
That's it. He's out, Crystal. Hours later, it was announced that new and exciting adventure is going to be CNN's streaming platform. So let's put that statement up on the screen. Chris Wallace is joining CNN to anchor not on CNN, but CNN Plus, what they call much anticipated streaming subscription service. I am thrilled to join CNN Plus after decades in broadcast and cable news. I'm excited to explore the world of streaming. As I embark on this adventure, I'm delighted and honored to join Jeff Zucker and his great team. I can't wait to get started, Chris Wallace said. They said he'll be hosting an interview program for the streaming service. I don't even know what the hell to say about this, Crystal. I mean, what are you doing? This man is 74 years old. He was actually a master of the cable medium. I'm not saying I like Chris Wallace or I don't like cable news even, period. But if cable has one purpose, it's interviewing high-profile people live to millions. That's it. Chris Wallace was actually pretty good at that.
Yeah.
The big interview, you know, the Fox News Sunday. The panel of his was always cringe, but what he was always pretty good at was having on some sort of politician and grilling him. And part of the thing is that even here, whenever you have a politician in them, the fact that they know it's not live, it just doesn't have the same level of stakes. You know, you've worked in live TV, I'm sure it's certainly something where when you have that level, the veneer and everybody's watching, it's just a totally different thing. He was actually pretty good at it. Now he's coming out and trying to hang out with us here in the streaming world. And I got really bad news for CNN for Chris. I'm sure they threw, you know, gobs of money at him. Does anybody want to actually watch a 70-something-year-old dude interview now what he's going to get are only B-rate politicians who don't care that much about his streaming service? Do you actually want to pay and seek that out to watch and stream it? The answer is probably no.
Yeah.
I have no idea what he's doing. This is, I can't imagine going out at CNN Plus after your dad was a legendary newsman and you anchored probably the most watched Sunday show in the whole country. It's a total joke. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I actually have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, number one, you know, he's the type at Fox News who, of anybody there, he had the most mainstream credibility.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
People kind of put him in a category by himself. There's a few others that, you know, Brett Baer and some others who get the news imprimatur. But he was really the one who had the most sort of mainstream cred. And yet, you know, he played his role at Fox News.
Yeah, he did a good job.
No, I don't mean that.
Oh, okay.
At cable news, I do think, I agree
Yeah.
with you that, you know, he was very willing to press politicians on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah.
And because he had the platform of that Sunday show, you know, these are some of the few places where politicians sort of feel like they have to go on.
Yep.
So even if you give them a tough interview, they still are likely to
still do
come back. And so he was good at that and he was willing to do it. The thing with cable news is everyone is scripted into a role, right? And this is part of why you don't want to do cable news anymore. And I don't want to do cable news anymore. Although I would say, you know, if there was a particular role where I felt like I could be useful in furthering conversation, I'm like, I don't think either one of us rule it out entirely.
No, if I cared a lot about something, I would do it.
Of course, but you have to know going in what the part is that they want you to play. So, for example, as someone who's on the left, who went on Fox News a lot of times, I always knew that my job was either, that what they wanted me to do was either to be like, even Democrats are critical of X, Y, or Z thing on the Democratic side, or they want you to be like the, you know, the paid heel, the idiot, right? To come on and either be like stupid or be hated or be, you know, like just that person for the audience to serve as the villain. And for Chris Wallace, part of what his role at Fox News was to provide cover for the insanity that was happening in so many other parts of the network. So they point to Chris Wallace and they point to Brett Baer and they point to Martha McCallum and a few others to say, oh no, we have a serious news operation. And so in a way, they're providing cover for some of the more, you know, ridiculous and absurd and inflammatory parts of the network. And even though I'm sure there are a lot of, you know, sort of mainstream beltway journalists here who think very highly of Chris Wallace, the reality is he never like pushed back on that direction
he was
of the network.
Yeah, he was definitely part of it.
Fully part of all of that, even as he was willing to do a lot of things better and with more character in his own program than other corners of the network would do. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is the CNN Plus piece, which is just like, I would love to know how much they're paying him.
He's already a multimillionaire. That's why I don't get it.
But the whole strategy for the CNN Plus thing is such trash.
Yeah,
like Casey Hunt and Chris Wallace, no one is going to watch these people. No one is going to pay to watch these people. Are you kidding me? Cable news has the audiences it does because you have, you know, it's on in the background. It's ambient background noise. All these anchors are replaceable and totally interchangeable. And there are very, very few personalities who actually could draw people in on their own merits. It's not like a meritocracy out there on cable news. In fact, oftentimes they pick people who are sort of the most pablum and the most boring not to upset the apple cart so that their sponsors don't get upset. So to think you're going to be able to go out into a more sort of free market space where you have to actually compete for viewer number 1, that is not happening.
And
it is not happening.
It is not happening at all. And I would say, what you described, that phenomenon, I think is at all 3 of these cable networks, right? The reality is that CNN is Chris Cuomo. It is Brian Stelter. It is the most ridiculous, clownish parts. And yes, they also have decent journalists. MSNBC is Rachel Maddow. It is Chris Hayes. It is Russiagate conspiracy, for all of the great people that they may have covering. It's part of the most disgusting and difficult balance of all of these organizations. It is interesting, though. So apparently, and he's been leaking this, obviously, to the New York Times and all of them, he was very upset about that Tucker Carlson Patriot Purge documentary, which we've talked here about, in which they specifically explore whether the feds were involved on January 6th. I do think it is telling that that also was the push point for him, for the dispatch neocons that we described previously, apparently for Brett Baer, also went to the head of the Fox News network. Again, Chris is obviously leaking this, and what the full story is, I don't know.
Yeah, I sort of don't buy it, because just knowing how these contract talks go, when your contract is going to be up as a prominent, cable news host like Chris Wallace is, those conversations start a year before your contract ends.
So do you think it's like a convenient heel to be like, oh, it was Tucker?
I think so. And here's the other thing, is like, look, I haven't watched it. I'm sure there are things in there that are outlandish and ridiculous and all of those things, right? Just based on what I have seen about the documentary. But if that's your problem, like, I'd respect it so much more if you went out and said something about it. Like, go out and own it and make the case. It's so cowardly. And that's kind of the point I was making earlier, is like, he would make these little, like, sort of subtle digs at different hosts' coverage, or he would plan himself as sort of a figure apart from the rest of the muck and the mud at Fox News. I just don't find that really honorable. If you have an issue with the direction of the coverage, especially now that you're leaving, like, say something. Don't just leak it to Deadline or whoever that was the real thing you were.
To the New York Times.
Right. Exactly, that you were unhappy with. Come out and make the case, and let's talk about it. So that's a part of this that I find, even as he exits, he's really unwilling to say what he actually thinks about Fox News or cable news writ large. The other thing that I was thinking about when I was, preparing to cover this story is, obviously you have a lot of churn and turnover in cable news right now.
Right.
Cuomo was out, not because he wanted to be, but anyway, he's out. But over at MSNBC, Brian Williams is leaving. Rachel Maddow.
Right,
Pierce,
she's out.
Her daily show, she'll stay at MSNBC, but it looks like her daily show is going to end in the spring. And I really think that even cable news hosts are sort of sick of cable news.
I think you're right.
That's part of what he's saying here, is like, I don't really want to do this game anymore. I'd like to interview some other people in a different format. And this is because, having been a cable news host, I can tell you, it's soul-sucking. And especially now when their ratings are such trash and they can't even pretend like they're on top of the world, it's, I think they find the format also, like, sort of brain deadening and stultifying and all that stuff. So that's part of why you see a number of people making the move to the exits.
I think what always made it work for them is that they were famous. They were important. And the real reality of it is like, in a disaster movie or something, and then they would pay, like, CNN's John King to be in the movie and be like, the Joker is taking over something.
Yeah.
Would they really do that today? I was watching a documentary, I forget what it's called, and they actually played a clip of Tim Ferriss on his podcast. It was The Alpinist. And it was about this guy. He was a very young guy who he died, but he was a very skilled mountain climber and alpinist and free spirit. Anyway, but I remember watching that and being like, wow, they're not playing a clip from cable. They're playing a clip from a podcast in which he talks about this guy. And I was like, that is like the flippening of power, as in they recognize that is where the valuable conversation and the cultural power is. And so I think for many of these people, it probably drives them mad that a lot of the people are having them on in the background while they're listening to a Joe Rogan or their favorite comedy podcast or a My Favorite Murder or what if Dak Shepard, whatever the hell he's doing, or Breaking Points. Any of these things. And for them to lose that, that was what it wasn't just about the money. Because let me tell you, these people are all miserable and they all work terrible hours as well. So they're all like pretty crazy. So that was what made it so worth it for them. And I think in Chris's mind, he's jumping into the streaming game where the real cultural relevance is. He just doesn't realize, dude, nobody's going to pay.
They don't.
Like, why would you pay for that?
Deluded themselves into thinking that people actually care about like them and what they have to say.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think you're right about this. This is a point that Glenn makes a lot. Is there's a lot of jealousy of people who are independent, who are in the podcast field or have YouTube shows or whatever, because they sort of feel like, at least the more honest and self-aware of them, feels like, well, I had to like sell out some of my principles to be able to play the game here. And now you're able to like make a living and do what you want and have total freedom, and you actually get to say what you think about everything and choose which topics you're gonna cover and have total control and not be subject to this like, you know, toxic top-down bureaucracy that exists at all of these networks. And so I think people like Chris Wallace, potentially, Casey Hunt, potentially, they delude themselves into thinking like, oh, maybe I could have that too, but you've already sold out. Your credibility is too late. I'm sorry, that ship has sailed. But I do think that does drive. Part of it is even they feel like they recognize, I mean, I've talked to these, you know, a number of these hosts, they recognize how crappy the medium is and how depressing it is to do these like short segments where you can never actually dig into an issue and where you have very little control over what the topics are, and you've got to pretend like you really care about whatever issue of the day or Trump outrage of the day or whatever it is, when sometimes you do and sometimes you really don't. It is soul-sucking, and so when they look at people who have that like freedom and independence and are gaining in cultural relevance, yeah, they feel jealous.
They definitely do. I think it's a big part of it. Chris, we wish you the best, but we'll probably never hear about you ever again. So. Sorry, man. I don't know what else to say. All right.
Sometimes the truth hurts. Yeah. Hey, guys, thanks so much for watching.
Proportionality. That's
Zuschauer, Zuhörer, herzlich willkommen zu einem weiteren Taz Talk, den zweiten schon heute Abend, der, glaube ich, sehr, sehr spannend wird. Wir reden über ein wichtiges Thema, das die Taz sowohl im Blatt als auch auf den Fluren und bei Zoom schon immer sehr stark beschäftigt hat, das Thema Identitätspolitik, Klassenpolitik, das Thema Diversity. Ich bin einfach mal so frei und stelle mich als erstes selbst vor, bevor ich meinen Gast Benn Michaels vorstelle. Ich heiße Jörg Malasena, ich bin Sozialrechtler, unsere Arbeit unterstützt, und der Untertitel ist, wie wir lernen, zugeschaltet ist, muss ich leider jetzt schon hinweisen, keine honor, can't understand what we're talking about. It's Benn Michaels. Thank you for coming on all the way from the other side of the big pond.
Yes, so thank you very much for having me, and thank you and all your audience for trying to listen to someone speak in English. It's a tribute to Germany. If we tried to do this in German in America, not a single person would listen. So it's a tribute to Germany that, in fact, you can have any audience at all, and I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right into it. So the topic of the night is identity politics, it's diversity, it's class politics, and the dichotomy that may be between the former and the latter. And it's if you look at the title, this is the English edition. It's called The Trouble with Diversity: How We Learn to Love Identity and Ignore Inequality. That's a pretty straightforward title. It tells you exactly what it is. One thing that struck me the most about it, I was a correspondent in the US before I moved back to Germany and became an editor for Taz. And while I was reporting about poverty issues in the US, there was like a lot of white poverty that I saw, as well as like native poverty, Black poverty, all kinds of poverty, because I focused on social reporting. And I kind of felt like poverty and economic injustice that wasn't, like connected to some sort of discrimination didn't really take place in large parts of the media. And if you're starting to look into that issue a little bit about, class versus identity, naturally, you find the name Walter Benn Michaels really quickly. So I already did an interview with Walter. I think it might have been 2.5 years ago, in the middle of the campaign, and I thought it'd be great to bring you on right now to introduce your thoughts to a German audience. And I guess the first question is, this book already came out in 2006, so we were kind of like ahead of the curve with a debate that only has gotten stronger and stronger. How did you come up with the idea for the book? And what is the trouble with diversity?
Yes, I'd say two things. First of all, although I admit 2006 might be a little ahead of the curve, at least you could publish it in 2006. It's not at all clear to me that I could get this book published for the first time in the US if I were to write it today. Things have become even more, as it were, polarized, and the hostility to any critique of diversity from the left, from the right, and well, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, there is still an important critique of diversity, although extremely inadequate and mistaken one. But from the left, there's a lot of hostility to the idea of a critique of diversity. I got involved in it really for academic reasons. I wrote a book in the 1990s on race and racism in American literature, basically from about 1890 to the 1920s. And in doing it, I was struck by the fact that people had exotic but powerful ideas about what race was. People thought back in the 20s, race was a biological phenomenon. Obviously, Germans are familiar with this. People thought that there was such a thing as the racial soul. People had all kinds of commitments to the importance of race. So I was writing really about that and about that period. But in doing so, I was very much struck by the fact that as I was writing, so this is now 25 years ago, although everybody knew that there was no such thing as the racial soul, and although everybody knew that there actually was no adequate account of race as a biological, that is a scientific entity, people were nonetheless not only still committed to talking about race, but were even more committed to talking about race, getting more and more committed, as it were, by the years. This is like 1994, 95. And when you ask yourself why are we committed to racializing, to go back to your original thing, the American population, to thinking about poor Black people, poor white people, poor indigenous people, poor Latina people. Why are we doing that? It became almost instantaneously clear. It's a very simple thesis. We were much more interested in trying to solve the problem of poverty insofar as we could think of poverty as a problem of discrimination. In other words, in neoliberal societies, capitalist societies, discrimination is a problem. And the morality of American capitalism is committed, although not sufficiently and not consistently, but committed to the ideal of anti-discrimination. So what people were worried about was poverty, but primarily poverty insofar as they could understand that poverty as a function of discrimination. I can give you an example which wasn't available then, but I was in a conversation a few weeks ago with a friend, and we were talking about the question being raised. So I don't know, in Germany, have people seen the great South Korean movie, Parasite?
Oh yeah, it was wildly popular here too. By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt you for a second because I forgot one important thing in the introduction. Questions open for everybody. There's an email address that you can contact if you have a question for Walter that I'm going to read out later, which is called taztalk@taz.de. Ich sage es nochmal schnell auf Deutsch. Sie können Fragen einsenden unter taztalk@taz.de und später in der Sendung lese ich die dann vor und lasse sie von Walter beantworten und kann gerne kontrovers sein. Wir diskutieren hier gerne. I'm sorry for that interruption. Yeah, Parasite was a big deal in Germany, and it was analyzed as kind of like a class metaphor.
Yeah, so it clearly was, right? So people were thinking in the US, why are the South Koreans so good at doing this? The Americans not so good. And there's a very simple reason. South Koreans confront their poverty and their increasing inequality, and they know whatever caused it, racial discrimination did not cause it. It's South Koreans exploiting South Koreans. Whereas in America, what we've always liked to think is that the problem of our poverty is the problem of racism. So Black people are disproportionately poor. Latina people are disproportionately poor. The problem is the problem of discrimination. What we don't like to think is that, no, the fundamental problem of our poverty is caused by capitalism, not by discrimination within capitalism. Discrimination tells us that more people makes it, more Black people will get to be poor, disproportionately poor. But it doesn't create the poverty itself, So what became clear right away was that the American affection, commitment to thinking about racializing the population was an expression of our sincere, albeit flawed and inadequate, desire to eliminate discrimination and our complete indifference to the idea of eliminating the structural inequality that follows in any capitalist society. And of course, that's equally true of Germany. I mean, Germany, you were talking about how now these issues are alive in Germany, but in Germany for the last 25 years, the gap between the rich and the poor gets wider and wider. I looked a little research for this. So since 1993, the richest 50% of Germans have been able to double their wealth, right? That's the top part. While the wealth of households in the bottom 50% hasn't grown at all. As a result, the share of total wealth owned by the bottom 50% is half what it was. So there are many different versions of that. So what you want to say is that it's not really an American thing, it's not really a German thing. What one's struck by is that it's a capitalist thing. That is, in the current state of development of capitalist societies, on the one hand, the gap between the rich and the poor gets greater and greater than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the response to that is not social programs that attempt to diminish the gap between the rich and poor. The response to that is to blame it on racism. So that it's almost like I wouldn't say it's a scientific law, and I wouldn't even say it's an economic law, but it sure is a tendency in modern societies. The greater the gap between the rich and the poor, the higher the level of exploitation, the more the desire to talk not about exploitation, but about discrimination. So to me, what has been the outstanding fact, I mean, an early version of The Trouble with Diversity, after it came out in English, was translated into French. It was exactly the same situation there. People say, oh, well, I haven't really thought about this. But in fact, since this came out in France, and when it was coming out in France too, the inequality between rich and poor has grown greater, and the commitment to diversité has grown greater still. So, I mean, it's a sure sign. If you look around and just calculate how much people are talking about the importance of anti-racism, you can also see how much greater the inequality has grown. And it's important to remember, it's not an inequality primarily between Black people and white people. There are inequalities between Black people and white people, and we can talk about that. But the majority of poor people in the US are white. The majority of people making below $15,000 a year, which is almost no money at all, are white. The majority of people making below $20,000 a year are white. Just the majority of poor people are white. Those poor people are not poor because they are the victims of racism. They are not the victims of racism. There are no white people, despite what Trump and the fascists say. There are no white people in the US who are the victims of racism. What are they the victims of? They're the victims of capitalism. So the basic idea, always the trouble with diversity, is that the more it becomes clear in a certain sense that the real problem is capitalism, the more capitalists want to talk about the real problem being racism.
It's interesting that you're, mentioning the wealth gap in Germany, because as you may know, in Germany, basically the most neoliberal reforms and dismantlement of the welfare state was facilitated by the Green Party and the Social Democrats, right? And arguably the Green Party with, cutting welfare, cutting pensions, that they, hurt like a lot of minorities in Germany, because the minorities are mostly people, who work in like low wage jobs and, who need good pensions and, a functioning welfare state. And basically the Green Party did those reforms. And then I think they started like a diversity program for journalists. So basically everybody like loses their pensions and their wealth. And what you get in return is like people writing columns about how hard their childhood was, which is an interesting connection. It brings me to the question, like, who benefits from, what I could call, or what one could call, racialization of, class issues and wealth distribution. Like, why is it framed that way in the US?
Well,
and maybe here too.
Yeah, so I can give you an example. We talked about this, I think, a little bit the last time we talked a few years ago in New York. If you can get an example by going back to, which now seems like a long time ago, although it was after the book came out, the Obama administration. So y'all remember Obama, we remember Obama. So way, 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 way better than Trump, but not good. In the Obama administration, one of its major commitments was education, and education, for communities of color, is the phrase used on now. The idea was Obama's thing was teach everyone how to code. So code is what? Teach everyone how to, to work with computers in various ways. That's the way the
Learn
future.
to code.
Yeah. But in fact, the largest growing job in the US then is now had nothing to do with being able to code. The largest growing job in the US is healthcare, and it's healthcare workers. Healthcare workers don't need to learn how to code to be healthcare workers. Healthcare workers don't need to go to college to be healthcare workers. They actually don't even need to graduate from high school to be healthcare workers. Healthcare working is described as a low skill job, although actually anybody who's ever seen a healthcare worker knows it requires a lot of human skills. It also pays almost nothing. So here's a way of thinking about this, of who benefits from this. Right now, from the standpoint of anti-racism, from the standpoint of diversity, the debate about healthcare workers is this: the large majority of them are women, and the large majority of those women are women of color. So, okay, when you look at people who are being exploited by, and remember in the US, these are private healthcare companies, profit-making companies. When you look at these women, the labor force that's being exploited, the labor force is primarily women, and it's primarily minority. And why is that? That is undoubtedly true. It's because of discrimination, the history of discrimination. In other words, it's not part of my argument or any of my colleagues' our version of the anti-identity left to deny there is discrimination. There for sure is discrimination. So what should we do about it? If discrimination for you is the primary problem, then you want to say, look, it's unfair that so many of the people holding these low-wage jobs are women of color. And what you want to say, and this would be true, is that women of color should have exactly the same opportunity to rise in American society that white men do. And that in a just society, a society where there was no discrimination, the one we want to work toward, majority of those people working those jobs, again, making a wage you cannot live on. The majority of people working those jobs would not be women of color. Actually, 40% of them would be white men. It'd be the right proportion. They wouldn't be like 30% Latino women. They'd be like 14% Latino women. You'd have the right proportions. But if you think about that for a second, you realize that's a completely useless solution. Why is it not a solution? Because the difference would be just that you'd have a bunch of white guys who were living on wages that they could not survive on. And you'd have a bunch of more bosses who were Black or Latino women of color. Why is that better? The inequality is left unchanged. If you're seriously interested in solving the problem of inequality, the diversity solution, the anti-discrimination solution, doesn't actually help you solve that slightest bit. The anti-discrimination solution says, no, we're not worried about the inequality. We're worried about who benefits from and who doesn't benefit from the inequality. If you're the boss of the hospital, or you're the boss of the healthcare program, you want to say, look, the important thing to me is not that I hire women of color to do this job. The important thing to me is that I can make a profit because I pay people $25,000 a year to do this job, and the surplus value of their labor goes to me. That's the important thing. So if you want to combat that, if you want to combat those bosses, the crucial thing to worry about is not what the sex or race of the women holding the jobs is. The crucial thing to worry about is the jobs themselves. You want those people to be making $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 a year. So then, first of all, you don't care if they're mainly women of color. It's a good job. Right now, the whole anti-discrimination thing says we want to make sure that people aren't forced into taking bad jobs, that women and women of color, in this example, aren't forced into these bad jobs, that they have an opportunity to escape these jobs and become exploiters instead of the exploited. That doesn't solve the problem. The problem gets solved if you say, no, we want to change those jobs. We want to make it so that whoever takes those jobs are good jobs. Well, who does that threaten? That threatens the bosses. That threatens capital. Because capital, the private healthcare system, cannot survive as it is in the US if you have to pay those people twice the amount of money you're paying them now. So when you ask who, it's not just who does diversity serve, really it's who is served when you put anti-discrimination first, when you put anti-racism first, when you put anti-sexism first. When you put anti-racism and anti-sexism first, who is served is the bosses. That works for the ruling class. When you put anti-exploitation first, that's a direct attack on the ruling class.
It's interesting because I think it was even the Financial Times, which is not really a leftist publication, if I recall correctly. They just basically checked after a year of Black Lives Matters when all the companies jumped the bandwagon on, like we want racial equality now, and all those programs, how they implemented it. First of all, they only spent like a fraction of the money that they wanted to spend on, improving whatever working conditions for people of color. And what basically happened was that they mostly spent their money on like anti-bias trainings, which probably means that Robin DiAngelo made a lot of money. And it's interesting how like a lot of these anti-bias people, are kind of like from the consulting business or want to go into the consulting business somehow, because it's basically cheaper for them to pay to go like to some worker and tell them about their biases than raising the wages. And only 30% of the companies, actually made sure that Black workers or workers of color would get equal pay. So
there are
which
two
kind
things.
of like I'm sure like illustrates the dichotomy between like these two issues. But it also is a good lead-in for the subject generally. What do you think about basically the BLM wave, the movement as a whole, and what happened since the murder of George Floyd and the turn that movement has taken and the debate in the US about race?
So I have a colleague, Cedric Johnson, who's written actually brilliantly about the idea of Black politics recently. And Cedric describes Black Lives Matter as militant racial liberalism, and that's meant as a critique, not as not as praise. So what do we mean by racial liberalism? So first of all, I mean, you all saw it, everybody saw it. So in the summer of 2020, watching George Floyd get murdered on television was a completely horrifying experience for everyone involved. So I don't know anybody on the left, and truthfully, probably most people in the center and even most on the right, who don't believe, first of all, that was monstrous. It was completely unacceptable. The second thing that's also true, and this is where Black Lives Matter really comes in, right, is that many Black people been murdered by the police, were murdered by the police in 2020, and were the year before and have been in the year after since then. So when Black Lives Matter says, look, Black people being murdered by the police is a fundamental problem, and it's the tip of a larger iceberg, they're completely right. So there's a third thing that matters, though, which is that, as we know, if we think about it for a second, and we for sure know if we look it up, there are more white people every year, especially like unarmed white people. I mean, George Floyd was unarmed. The crucial thing is unarmed people being killed by the police. There are more white people, unarmed white people killed by the police in 2020 than there were unarmed Black people. We didn't see them on TV, but there are more unarmed white people. So what do we make of that? So the Black Lives Matter, and this is the militant liberalism part, Black Lives Matter says, well, yeah, for sure it's true that there were more, nobody denies there were more, you don't hear about it much, unarmed white people killed by the police, but it's not relevant, right? Because it's a disproportionately small number of people. That is, the US is a majority white nation, a smaller majority white, but still majority white. And it's minority Black. There are only 13.2% of Black people in the country, but many, many more, higher percentage of that were killed by the police. So the problem really is not simply being killed by the police. The problem is the disproportionate number of Black people were killed by the police, and that is the Black Lives Matter. So it's that disproportion, that emphasis on proportionality, that's at the heart of what Johnson calls the liberalism of Black Lives Matter. Why? Because the solution to the problem of people being killed by the police from the standpoint of disproportionality is not to end people being killed by the police. It's just the opposite. It's to make sure that people are not killed disproportionately by the police. As if only 13.2% of the people who were killed by the police were Black, that would be okay. But that's obviously not true. I mean, think about it. Supposing you have a man who every day he beats his daughter twice and he beats his son once. And you get Daughters Matter, And people say, well, it's outrageous that this person disproportionately beats his daughter. And the man is convinced. He says, yeah, I won't do that anymore. Instead, I'm going to beat her once a day and I'll beat him once a day. It's exactly proportionate. That's obviously not everybody gets. That's not a solution to the problem, because the problem is not inherent in the disproportionality. The problem is the harm itself. What you want is a society where people aren't being beaten by the police, not a society where some people aren't being beaten excessively by the police because of their race. If you think that race is the fundamental problem, then once again, you're not actually, and this goes, it's the same argument as the one for inequality. You're not addressing the fundamental problem, which is the violence of American police against the increasingly poor people they are required to control and subdue. You're actually addressing a kind of epiphenomenon of that problem, which is it would be okay if they control poor people, if only they control poor people proportionally, if only they control poor people fairly and not in a racist mode. But the problem, the primary problem here is not the racism, which no doubt exists, no doubt plays a role in this. The primary problem is that the police's job is to control the poor, and that the police, in controlling the poor, kill the poor, because everybody agrees the police aren't killing rich people on the streets of any city in the United States, whether they're black or white. So the problem with Black Lives Matter is what? The problem with Black Lives Matter is that it acts as if the issue is the disproportionality, when in fact the issue is the harm itself, is the murder by the police. The problem is it acts as if the fact that Black people get punished excessively is the problem, when the real problem is the punishment itself. It's just like it is with the money. It's as if you were to say poverty would be okay if only Black people were proportionately poor. But no, the point is to get rid of poverty. Say police killing people would be okay if only they killed people proportionally. But no, the point is to get rid of people being killed by the police.
I don't think anybody's arguing though that the police should kill more white people or that it should be an equal number.
Sure,
I mean,
not.
obviously, I mean, you could argue that basically police brutality against Black people might be framed in like a racial way, but it points to a larger problem. I'm guessing the question is like, can we do both? Can we talk about, like specific violence that is targeted, specific discrimination that is targeted against against women, while also, addressing the fundamental issues? Or isn't maybe, looking at specific, very targeted groups, isn't it a way to point at the larger problem?
Yeah, so it's the point I'm making, right, is that instead of it being a way to point at the larger problem, it's precisely a way of distracting from the larger problem. When you worry that Black people are disproportionately poor, you don't worry about getting rid of poverty. That's the whole point of anti-discrimination and diversity. You worry about making sure that poverty is, as it were, fair, that it isn't imposed on Black people disproportionately. So it's a way, instead of, people have always said, isn't this a way of getting at the deeper problem? They've been saying that for the last 25 years as the deeper problem gets deeper, and the other problem also goes unsolved. And it's because instead of being a way of getting at the deeper problem, it's a way of it not getting at the deeper problem. So when you take the police out and say, well, maybe if we give them all anti-bias training and help them do various other things, they'll stop killing so many Black people, that's fine. Actually, no one on the left anyway is opposed to that, but that's not going to solve the fundamental problem, which is that in our society, what is the job of the police? The job of the police is to protect people with property against people who don't have property. And that job is a job which is gonna be their job as long as there are people who do have lots of property and lots of people who don't. So everything from that standpoint gets worse every year. And when you say, no, the real problem here is like making sure that they don't kill Black people disproportionately for racist reasons, you're not only not pointing to the real problem, to the actual fundamental sort of like economic problem, you're completely thinking, no, we can manage that problem by, as it were, proportioning the harm more fairly. And in fact, that's what anti-discrimination, you said a little while ago, you were totally right, that a lot of this comes out of human relations departments, HR departments in the US, that's D'Angelo and all that. But actually that whole solution, this whole thing is a human relations solution to an increasingly disenfranchised and impoverished workforce, which is try to find ways of convincing people that their disenfranchisement is fair. That is to say, it's not a function of racism. It's not a function of sexism. It's just a function of the fact that they couldn't get better jobs. So trying to convince people that to have a kind of hierarchical system that's fair, that's the whole job of human relations. That's why those companies exist, to make their workers feel that they may be being fucked, but they're being fucked fairly, right? They're not being fucked because of their race, because of their sex, or because of their gender, because of whether they're trans or not. They're not being fucked for those reasons. They're being fucked just because they're workers. So
it's funny. It's funny. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say,
it's funny how in America's most states are like hire at will states, where they basically can fire everybody for no reason, but you can't be fired for discrimination. If you're saying, yeah, good luck, we don't have any use for you anymore. But if you say, get out because you're gay, then you can sue, which is kind of interesting. Let me just briefly repeat for our viewers that are just tuning in. Because we're having a controversial discussion here, obviously we want to open it up to everybody. So you can just write questions and mail them to us. The email address is taztalk@taz.de. Nochmal ganz kurz auf Deutsch. Wenn ihr Fragen habt oder Kommentare oder lieber Fragen, am besten auch offen, ne? Gerne an taztalk@taz.de schicken und dann lesen wir die hier gleich vor und besprechen die. Freue ich mich auf jeden Fall, wenn ihr noch weitere Fragen habt, die mir vielleicht nicht eingefallen sind. Let's kind of like make a little switch because I mean, we've talked earlier about, how a lot of people having opinions like the ones that you are voicing, leftists, are kind of like in the danger of being canceled. Or there's a lot of people, who wouldn't want these opinions to be voiced. I guess, I mean, like I was an avid viewer of Tucker Carlson, I'm not going to lie. And he has an interesting, Tucker Carlson, for our viewers in Germany, he's a right-wing, you could argue, at least dog whistling, white nationalist kind of guy. He's a host for Fox News, which is a very right-wing channel in the US. But once in a while, he uses like classist or class-based arguments, basically in order to shut down minorities. And I think he had like one of his talking points was basically just like, yeah, they're always talking about race, blah, 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 and discrimination. But basically the best indicator for poverty or whatever is class, and nobody's talking about class. And the funny thing is, I mean, it's ill-intended, but he's kind of right. And I mean, he does actually go to whatever, like small towns in Ohio that lost their factory. But I'm just wondering, the horseshoe theory, right? How do you, or how with scholars such as yours, distinguish their left critique of certain identitarian issues or identity politics from somebody who's doing that from the right? Like what's different from leftist than a right perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, the easy way to put that is to say being against identity is completely empty unless you're for economic equality. Put it a little more strongly, unless you're for socialism. In other words, it's the easiest thing in the world to go around saying, criticizing and actually making fun of in the extremes, the kind of excesses of anti-discrimination. And actually, the truth of it is that, nothing in my position or the people with whom I'm involved, we're not at all opposed to anti-discrimination. There's no single form of anti-discrimination law in the US that I don't completely support. Anti-discrimination should be enforced at every level. The thing we have the problem with is the complete commitment that we've got in the US, and that's characteristic of neoliberal societies in general. And I happily predict will become characteristic of German society too, in which the only kind of inequality you're prepared to oppose is the inequality produced by discrimination, and the others you leave alone. So first of all, completely against Carlson on that side, for all the anti-discrimination. But the second part then is, okay, what is Carlson or anybody else on the right commitment to economic equality? So, I mean, you can make a trip to a closed down factory in Ohio. Is he committed to socializing US healthcare? Is he committed, an IE, which is completely
probably not.
I have no doubt. Is he committed? I mean, think of Trump, right? Is he committed to actual socializing American housing and making housing available to all? Is he committed to eliminating the cost of education, to eliminating private universities, and in effect, socializing universities? So if he's committed to all those things, then we can talk. But the truth of it is that in American politics right now, being against identity right, is a way of being on the right as much as it is a way of being on the left. But the fundamental distinction, right, is that, or let's say a certain kind of, you can be against economic equality, you can be against socialism just as much by carrying on about identity as a way of making people, as it were, forget that the fundamental problem is the economic problem. So Carlson, to me, is, it's a version of basically, without a commitment to economic equality, really without a commitment to socialism, anti-identity politics is just another way of doing identity politics. It's a focus on discrimination. And actually now the current form, and the Tucker Carlson form, is complaining that white people are its victims. So it's only white people, white working class is a victim of discrimination. But like I said before, the white working class is indeed a victim in the US, but it's not a victim of discrimination. No one in the US suffers because they're white. It's a victim of exploitation. So what is Carlson's whole thing? Carlson's whole thing is to tell people that they are the victims of, he's telling white people that they're the victims of racism when they're not, they're the victims of capitalism. And on the left, that is identitarian left, we're telling black people that they're the victims of racism. That's at least a little more plausible because a bunch of them are the victims of racism. But actually, they too are really, in the end, the victims of capitalism. So you have a kind of organization of the identitarian left and the anti-identitarian right, and they all want to say the same thing. Whatever you're a victim of, it's not capitalism. But the truth is, actually, everybody is a victim of capitalism.
Speaking of capitalism and how to solve like inequalities, it's interesting. This might be a little too far out for our readers, but there's a thing called the 1619 Project that the New York Times put out a couple of years ago, which basically is a collection of essays that basically make the point that everything that's wrong in American society today is directly connected to slavery. And the way capitalism works is the way plantation used to work. Slave patrols became the police, something like that, which actually has been debunked by like a lot of socialist scholars in a way. But it's kind of like, I feel, if I remember correctly, like the thought process that's basically happening on, say the liberal side, not the leftist side of the country. And I think one of the most like intellectual essayists, not connected to 1619, but is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote an essay in 2014, basically arguing through like a very interesting read, actually, an essay to make a case for reparations that basically trace back all the racism, 100 years of Jim Crow, even more than that, 89 years, and hundreds of years of slavery, and just make basically the point that the wealth gap between black and white in the U.S. is almost exclusively like connected to racism and discrimination. If I'm misquoting this a little bit, I apologize, but I think that's basically the point that he's making. So if we're talking about, redistribution of wealth, like working class, wouldn't like reparations to basically, give black people a bunch of money to make up for what happened in the past centuries, wouldn't that kind of solve the problem or at least ease it?
Well, so actually the trouble with diversity, I actually don't oppose reparations. I sort of would oppose it now, but I didn't oppose it precisely on those grounds. It would at least give a lot of money to poor people. But there are a lot of things wrong with it. Reparations is a kind of pure example of what it means to be, it's a fundamentally conservative position. So what do I mean when I say it's fundamentally conservative, which is that its basic idea of justice is giving people back the property they ought to have had. It doesn't imagine anything outside of property. So think about the problem today of housing in the US. Actually, it is a small town, a kind of college town, north of Chicago called Evanston. And Evanston has in fact enacted a program of housing reparations. So if you or your an immediate ancestor were living in Evanston between, I can't remember the exact years, but something like 1915 and like late 1970s, when in fact there clearly were lots of laws in place and lots of practices in place supported by the government, which made it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for most Black people to actually get mortgages. Then the idea was that now you can get $25,000 as a down payment or as part of the mortgage to a house. So what's wrong with that? So there are two things that are wrong with that, right? One thing that's wrong with that is that if you're too poor to afford a mortgage on a house now in Evanston, but you're a white person, and it does nothing for you. All right. So why should that matter? Well, the idea there is that if you're a white person, you may be a victim in some way, or you're a poor person, but you're not a victim of racism. And we're only interested in the victims of racism. So as a kind of political project, that's kind of complicated because actually the majority of people, poor people in the US are white. The majority of people who can't afford housing in the US are white. But telling them, screw you. You have the wrong account of why you're poor. Your account of why you're poor maybe is because your dad's union got busted back in the 1950s, and your dad went broke and he lost the house, and you've never been able to get a good job since then. That's not the right history. You need to have the right history. The right history is only a history of racism. So that's kind of an arbitrary distinction. And it's not politically, as we can see in the US, a useful distinction because it actually creates a kind of enmity between the poor white and poor black, which is exactly the opposite of what people have always wanted on the left, which the old American slogan was black and white, unite and fight. So it's black and white, unite and fight, but the black guys get reparations, the white guys don't. But actually you can change that. Suppose you said, well, look, good point. What we should do is have reparations also for people who basically, whatever race they are, could not have access to mortgages. What we should do then is sort of say, yeah, if your dad's union was busted, and that's why by the local government or by the boss or whomever, yeah, you should get money for that too. So, but you still see there's a problem. And the problem is what? The problem is everybody should have access to housing. It doesn't matter like the history of how you don't. Everybody deserves housing, but these histories depend upon saying, no, really, the point is for us, reparations, it's not that everybody deserves housing. The point of reparations is that everybody deserves to get the property they would have had access to if either the state or some employer hadn't interfered with their right to property. It's like the opposite of Marxism. It's like if Marx had said, hey, look, it's not, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. It's like to each according to his ability to establish that he has a legitimate right to property that was stolen from him or his ancestors years ago. It's like the social justice of pure commitment to private property. So it's not actually a step on the road to the left. It's exactly the opposite. It's a step on the road to the right, saying the only claims that we'll actually allow are claims that are property claims. And the fact that reparations, which a few years ago seemed still pretty remote, has become increasingly central, is not that surprising. Because the people who are committed to it are on the right, even if they don't know it. And the people who are actually sort of a little bit more open to it now, who already know they are on the right, are a little more open to it because they get that what it is basically is a right-wing claim. In fact, the first person to enunciate it from a philosophical standpoint was the notorious right-wing libertarian philosopher at Harvard, Robert Nozick, who actually has a couple of pages in certain circumstances, people would be owed reparations because they've had their right to property denied them. So you just want to say the idea that in America today, reparations looks like a left-wing project is a complete sign of the absolute poverty of left politics in America today. It's a moment when the left becomes the ventriloquist dummy of the libertarian right by saying, yes, our property has been stolen from us. You have to return our property to us. So yeah, we can all respect Ta-Nehisi Coates and everybody else, but Ta-Nehisi Coates is on the right. If you want like guys who are on the left, you're going to have to not look at the 1619 project. You're going to have to not look at Ta-Nehisi Coates. You're going to have to look at people who actually aren't complete. Margaret Thatcher famously said about neoliberalism that economics was only the means. The goal was the soul. You didn't want to just control the economy. You wanted to control the economy to change the soul. The demand for reparations today is like a complete testimony to the success of Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism. They completely control the soul of the people who think of themselves as being on the left. They make Tony Blair look like a raging communist.
It's interesting how it's interesting. I think a year ago, Matt Brunig, I don't even know what he is, like political scientist or economist. He did some math basically on, Ta-Nehisi Coates' thesis about the wealth gap, and basically came up that if you would equally distribute wealth from white people to black people, it would benefit only like the up 10% of Black people, because the wealth gap within Blacks and within whites is basically the same, that 90% own nothing. And it would be, if it was a fair redistribution, it would be a bunch of money, billions of dollars going from trillions, probably from rich white people to rich Black people, which is kind of like illustrating this phenomenon. But before we open it up to questions.
Well, I just want to say, to put a point on that, right, before we go too far with it, it's just important to remember that basically 10% of white people, right, own like 80% of white wealth. So that, and about 30% of white people just have no wealth at all. And another 20-25% have like tiny bits of wealth. So the black-white gap is real, but it's really a function of the fact that almost all of the wealth in the US is owned by comparatively few number of white people. So that's really bad for almost all Black people, but it's also really bad for almost all white people. The point then, and so yeah, what Brunig says and what you just summarized, Brunig, that's the response to that, which is that if you want redistribution, you got to take those people's money away. And it's got to go to everybody. Universalism is the answer each time out. Universal redistribution of wealth. We don't care if they're white, we don't care if they're Black, we don't care what their race, gender, or sex is. All we care about is they're poor. If they're poor, they get it. That was the real, albeit temporary, traction of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, but that's a whole different story. That's for another TUTS talk, the whole Sanders thing. But we have an audience question coming in. People are apparently interested in the 1619 project that I briefly mentioned and hopefully not misrepresented too bad. Walter Raleigh is asking if, in your opinion, the 1619 project is revisionist, like historically revisionist, like is it revising history in an unjustified way because of the framing, I suppose is the question.
Right, so first of all, I compliment the person who's using the name Walter Raleigh, since that would be actually connected with the, I assume it's a pseudonym having to do with actually Walter Raleigh, who was part of the Virginia Project, for the English Walter Raleigh. So good joke. Second thing would be, yeah, I mean, it is revisionist history, but it's, again, it's right-wing revisionist history. It's not regarded by the right as right wing, but it's the kind of collaboration with the right. Because the point of it is to say that right from the very start, the true problem with America was racism and slavery. But you know, there's a great historian, I might add a Marxist Black historian, Barbara Fields. And Barbara Fields wrote early on, you know, slavery was not an example of racism. If the people who enslaved Black people had been racist, they wouldn't have gone and had hated Black people. They wouldn't have gone to the trouble of importing them from thousands and thousands of miles away to bring them to the South in order to hate them. The point of slavery was entirely economic. And if you look at the history of the origins of slavery, the point of it all the way down the line, right, is to get cheap labor to work first on tobacco, cotton, and then the other crops in the mid-Atlantic and the South. Slavery had an economic purpose. Racism, as Fields argues, it actually emerges as the after-the-fact justification for slavery rather than the cause of slavery. So the economic thing is at the heart of it. So there's a way now in which if what you want to do is make sure that economics are not at the heart of your social analysis, one way you do that, and especially you like doing that if you're at the upper middle class, you've actually personally benefited from the way the economic distribution of wealth in the US. One way you make sure that economics is not at the center is you put morality at the center right from the start. So you go back and say, no, the original sin, I mean, the very concept, right, is a moral concept. The original sin of American life is racism. But, you know, I mean, again, Germans have inequality of wealth. So you could argue that the original sin of German life was racism, but it wasn't anti-Black racism, it was anti-Semitism. And that's a bad argument anyway. I mean, this would go in a very different direction. But the question of the sort of social origins of German anti-Semitism is also a very complicated one, and also one that is actually not helped by being reduced to simply a moral question. So there's a certain sense in which the revisionism here is the attempt to make the political economy central, to make a certain version of the morality primary, and therefore to produce a vision of American life in which, far from wishing to undermine or alter or in any fundamental way destroy our current economic institutions, what we want to do is purify them by cleansing them of the sin of racism. And yeah, the fact that the New York Times is committed to this makes complete sense, since the New York Times has been, during my entire increasingly long And with respect to politics, very, very sad life. The New York Times has been the center of a kind of respectable liberal leftism in U.S. American life. So, the 1619 Project comes to you with the imprimatur of the people who fucked us up in the first place. And they now, want to say, and they, with some success, that no, this is like the way to fundamentally alter and improve American lives.
There's another question coming in. I'm sorry. There's another question coming in. And by the way, last chance, everybody, if you want to send in some questions, do it now, because we're heading into the last quarter here. Before I'm going to have one final question, but let's go with, I don't know, Brinkerhoff Basics. Is that also a funny name that I don't know? Is it possible in America? Is it possible in America to obtain universal social programs while race holds the heart of performative policy and creates a faux outrage amounts activist class to advocate for more? That's a very long sentence, dude.
I think if I understood the question correctly.
Hold on.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, it's not possible. In other words, I don't think, it's possible to advocate for universalist projects, but right now, you sent me a question, maybe you went to ask you, but you sent a couple of questions before, we haven't gotten to them all, but I was struck a bunch of them were questions about how to make things better. How am I pessimistic about?
Yeah, that's my last question. That's my last question, so go ahead and answer it.
Yeah, so you should ask your last question then right now, because I can give the same answer I just gave to the other one. The answer is going to be no, we're totally fucked. There's no way to make things better. That's my actual view. I mean,
really?
I can say,
so why don't we just jump off a bridge then? I mean, there's really no hope.
We all have our little lives, and if you're young people sort of thinking out there to get involved in politics, and you hopefully are more hopeful than I am, since I've been doing this a long time, and as I say, the history has been a history of failure. When I wrote The Trouble with Diversity, it was regarded as a kind of controversial book, but it was within the boundaries of controversy. In other words, there were people for it, there were people who were against it, there were people sort of somewhere, no one was in the middle, but they were somewhere. If I were to publish that book in the US today, it'd be just like universally excoriated, except by a few thousand people on the kind of version of the class left. So you want to say things have not gotten better in the last 20 years. So the hopeful thing to say is this: it should be clearer. Right? It should be. I say it should be because I don't think it is. It should be clear that even the fact that The Trouble with Diversity is finally being translated into German and various other countries, this is not an American problem. It's not a German problem. It's a function of capitalism and of the particular conflicts produced by neoliberal capitalism. Right? That's the question. So why am I pessimistic? I'm pessimistic because basically all the solutions that are being offered are more neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism's wet dream is like a kind of structured hierarchy of exploitation, which is freed completely of discrimination, freed of racism, freed of sexism. The happy ending would be half the CEOs of American companies making $15, $20, $35 million a year, half of them are women, and 13.2% of them are Black. No racism, equal opportunity everywhere. Indeed, equal opportunity is everybody's sort of final fantasy of what justice should be. So the reason I'm pessimistic is because it's an echo chamber. It's the people on the left saying a version. I mean, I said in the book, the people on the left are the human relations department of the people on the right. That doesn't mean they have real conflicts. And it doesn't mean that the worst version of the right, which probably will take place in the US, won't be even more bad than what we've got now. But it does mean that there's basically almost no commitment to opposing capitalism itself. The commitment is instead to a more just, a more fair, an anti-racial, an anti-racist capitalism. And in the US, I have no hope that we get beyond that, at least in my lifetime. But maybe that's why I can afford to be hopeless. My lifetime isn't going to last that much longer. I'm 73 goddamn years old. You people are younger. If you were to achieve my level of hopelessness right now, yeah, you might as well jump off the bridge. So you should ignore my hopelessness and think he can afford to think we're fucked because he'll be dead pretty soon anyway. Whereas you all can't afford.
I'm sorry to interrupt your pessimism, but we're kind of running out of time. And there's one more question
running out of time.
which is actually interesting. It's true.
Yeah.
Soon you'll be free. Soon you'll be free. There's one more question coming up again from Walter Raleigh. What do you think about the cancel culture debate? And let me just add on to this. Have you had like any issues about being canceled? People didn't want to have you, or like on campus and stuff?
Yeah, the first time I was canceled, if you buy The Trouble with Diversity, it begins with that. The first time I was canceled was in Germany. And there's a little bit more about it in the book, but I won't have much to say about it now. So yeah, I have been canceled, but I don't think the cancel culture debate is at all crucial. My life doesn't suffer because some German American studies program is afraid that if I talk to them on Zoom, they will somehow be made unsafe. It's silly and it's stupid. It's a mark of their political uselessness, but it doesn't hurt me and it doesn't hurt the world all that much. The problem is the fundamental inequality. The problem is the problem of exploitation. The problem is not the problem of free speech. Free speech is a real problem. We can deal with that, et cetera. But if you're on the left, you should not let yourself, in my view, be distracted by the phantom of the enemy is cancel culture. The enemy is neoliberal capitalism. Cancel culture is like a momentary event in the history of neoliberal capitalism. Don't worry about that. And really, for people who are worried about that, that's another sign they don't give a fuck about neoliberal capitalism, as they aren't worried about the real problems. They instead want to just complain about cancel culture. So I'm not here to worry about cancel culture. I'm here to worry about capitalism.
Walter, let me tell you, I didn't feel unsafe for a single second tonight in this conversation. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for this interesting discussion that we've been having. I'm going to switch back to Germany a little bit to tell people about the other awesome Taz talks that we're having on. Again, thank you, Walter, Benn Michaels. This is going to be on YouTube, so you can rewatch it many, many, many times if you're interested in our discussion. Jetzt wechsle ich mal wieder zurück auf Deutsch, denn wir kommen jetzt zum Ende. Ich habe gerade noch mal Walter irgendwie gedankt für dieses sehr, sehr interessante Gespräch. Ich kann noch mal darauf hinweisen, dass man die wundervolle Arbeit der Taz unterstützen kann, und zwar online mit Spenden. Bei Taz zahle ich, oder man kann auch ein Abo abschließen. Beides sehr, sehr empfehlenswert und hilft uns bei unserer Arbeit. Und es gibt weitere Taz Talks, die genauso lebendig hoffentlich sind wie der, den wir jetzt gerade hier hatten. Und zwar ist der nächste Taz Talk schon morgen um 19 Uhr. Überstunden ist offensichtlich der Titel. Ein Gespräch mit der Schriftstellerin Elisa Aseva über ihr neues Buch, das auch Überstunden heißt. Aha.
Jacobin. We have a dominant cultural logic or kind of common sense around poverty where we think it's a matter of, that there is a fair marketplace, right? And that those that are deserving and skilled are rewarded by that fair marketplace. And if they're not, then it's because of some pathology or, a personal failure. That wasn't the common sense about poverty in American history. And there was a turn towards it that I don't think people are fully aware of. So, and it's particularly impactful, obviously, for the racial justice movement. And I think, famously through the Moynihan Report, culture of poverty kind of line, even though I think that was maybe slightly misunderstood in what he was trying to say, but there was a liberal turn in kind of treating poverty like it was a set of behaviors, attitudes, affects, and pathologies, and that it should be targeted that way. And so you get the famous, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, right? Or you get a respectability politics that's telling Black people that in order to combat issues of racism or disenfranchisement, the goal for them should be to better function for the standards of the market and to eliminate those pathologies. And despite our progress, I think it's gotten worse in a way. Now mindfulness is part of every corporate boardroom, no matter what race you are. I think there are ways in which that tendency has gotten more extreme. So I would love for you to unpack the history of that.
Well, I'll get the ball rolling and I'll turn the virtual mic over to my pop after this. I know that Michael Katz who was a scholar I'd very much admired, and so that means that I really liked his work. But I was surprised to learn that in early 2000s that he insisted that underclass ideology had run its course, that the appeal of underclass ideology had faded. when, if anything, it struck me that it was hegemonic, even more hegemonic, right? People maybe didn't use the term underclass by the early 2000s, but you didn't need the term anymore because it was just part of the common sense of what poor people were, across racial lines, I might add. So I had, for a number of years, beginning about 10 or 15 years ago, I frequently asked my students what the defining characteristics of poor people were. And there was really one answer I was looking for. An interesting thing is, I rarely got the answer that I was looking for. What I got from them was that poor people were they didn't work hard. So they were lazy, basically. They didn't value education. They were irresponsible. So they used drugs and made a lot of babies. And the last thing that students were disposed to say is that they were unemployed, underemployed, or just fundamentally for some other reason, didn't have enough money. And so that was, along with the response to Hurricane Katrina, I would say too, that was a clear expression of the hegemony of this stuff. And what we get, as you said, Ariella, and my father had alluded to earlier, is an insistence that poverty is fundamentally a character flaw. And you see this all over the place, right? I mean, you see this in the stand-up work of comedians ranging from, it's not a big range that I'm going to point to, I'll just point to two that I like, Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. You see versions of that running through their stuff to varying degrees. And you could certainly make the case that prior to the New Deal, people understood poverty, viewed poverty through the lens of defectiveness too. I mean, W.B. Du Bois, it's funny that people often enough attach themselves to Du Bois at the stretch of his life where it might make sense to call him a radical Democrat, but overlooking how long he lived and what kind of politics he had, let's say, in the 1890s, that informed his take on the take on poverty and Black Philadelphia that one finds in the Philadelphia Negro.
Also, sorry, just to briefly interject, I think a lot of these things also were part and parcel of a eugenicist notion of the way that intelligence is spread across race, or gendered notions of intelligence, things that presumed like a biological primacy to what would make one successful. And I think Du Bois more than nodded at that.
Definitely
more
more
of his notions.
Definitely more than nodded. But even in his and others more enlightened moments, there's a culturalist dimension to this. I mean, I don't know that you can always clearly distill from the culture of poverty and the biology of poverty for those who embrace those kinds of frameworks. But the subjects of my first book, the National Urban League, certainly on the one hand pushed back against eugenics, or at least the scientific racism understanding of eugenics in the years before the New Deal. But on the other hand, the way that they pushed back against eugenics came down to kind of culturalist understandings of poverty. At least in part, right? That centered on cultural tutelage for, the benighted Black migrant masses, let's say. And interesting enough, I mean, something on the spectrum of Robin DiAngelo, in a sense, but that's not fair to the Urban League. It was much better than Robin DiAngelo, for what it's worth. I've thus set the bar pretty low, though, so that's a problem. But anyway, insofar as they presumed that if Blacks demonstrated their assimilability, that those demonstrations of acculturation would basically push back effectively against racism. Obviously, when you get to the New Deal and the Popular Front, though, the sensibilities of even fairly conservative Black Americans change quite a bit, and you get an understanding of poverty that's much more rooted in political economy. You have Black activists who insist, among other things, that finally, at this point, that the Booker T. Washington framework that should actually sound kind of familiar to us now, kind of individualist, almost bootstraps, but certainly entrepreneurial-oriented strategy for group uplift, in which entrepreneurs would pull up the masses of Blacks.
It's like the first hustle culture with influencer was Booker T. Washington.
Yeah. I mean, minus the pernicious influence of Russell Simmons and the downstream pernicious influence of Yo MTV Raps many, many decades down the line, but very much so. But again, by the Great Depression, certainly by the New Deal, Black activists and political organizers understood that to be backward because they appreciated the fact that in capitalism, most people couldn't be entrepreneurs, right? So, I mean, most of us had to be workers, and that was the case certainly for Black Americans. So you have that piece that informs the pushback against that stuff. And the path forward, as they understood it, since there was a kind of randomness. I mean, there were forces beyond the control of any individual Black person or white person. The path forward to racial group progress wasn't entrepreneurialism as they saw it, but something more on the spectrum of social democracy for many. I mean, you can look at, let's say, the NAACP annual conference from 1933, and literally have people who are participants, right? So not random Joe Schmoes, but participants literally pushing back against the Washingtonian understanding of group progress that I alluded to explicitly and unambiguously, right? And in that moment, where millions of whites have been impacted negatively, some devastated, and an even greater percentage of Blacks have been devastated by the Great Depression, then you get an unambiguous appreciation for the problem with culturalist interpretations of inequality, right? And those come back, obviously, to jump ahead in Cold War, and they come back with abandon. Now, one thing that's distinct, I suppose, from the Cold War era with the invention of poverty as something, as a condition that exists apart from political economy, is that really was a pushback, right? I mean, that was on the heels of a broad collective understanding that poverty wasn't poverty, but instead it was joblessness and low wages. And it's not a done deal in the 50s. It takes a while for that side to win. And my father alluded to a number of the political forces that had to come in line to get us to where we were by Moynihan. But when you get to the Kennedy-Johnson administration, it's certainly not accurate to say that the jig is up, because there's still some more fighting to be done on this matter. But it's pretty clear at that point, in retrospect anyway, that this was the beginning of the end, right? Or maybe it was the end of the end by Nixon, I suppose, because the beginning of the end was a little earlier. I imagine my dad wants to elaborate on this. So I'll shut up and turn the virtual mic over to him.
Yeah, I could just say a little bit more about this, but yeah, I think that's right. I mean, but yeah, I think it is useful to say something about how that struggle in the 50s went, right, and played out. And I know this isn't what we had anticipated talking about. Probably not what you guys anticipated for us to talk about either. But so for this other book that I've been working on for a long time, I've known this because I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, and I read this stuff then as text. But I've become much more impressed at how central the role of all the American social sciences were in the decade and a half after World War II for making class and political economy absolutely invisible in discussion of American life, right? It's kind of shocking the way they did it, right? Well, the sociologists were the worst. Now, I'm not talking about economists, because they worship in a different church than the rest of us do. And it's the church where the cross hangs upside down, as far as I've noticed. But the psychologists aren't that much better. But anyway, the psychologists, the sociologists, the political scientists, and even the anthropologists, for whom I tend to have a softer spot, well, it's extraordinary how they went on a full-bore campaign to turn class into culture and to make political economy invisible. The sociologists did it most flamboyantly, right? Because they literally redefined class as a category of culture and did stuff like define classes by the kind of stuff you had in your living room and shit like that, right? But the working class in particular increasingly becomes like a category that's in effect of ethnicity. So it's like gendered, right? So it's male and it's white and it typically wears a hard hat and a plaid shirt and is by definition conservative. So you can't be working class without being Archie Bunker, basically. And I mean, political scientists did the same thing. The others did the same. Same kind of stuff. So by the time you get around to Moynihan, I think the most, the most insidious thing that Moynihan does in that report on the Negro family comes before he gets into it, even, right? So in the preface, he just asserts that in America, the way that we think about equality now is between groups. So it doesn't have anything to do with like rich versus poor. It's like how my group is stacking up against your group, and that's what opens the door for him to discuss Negro poverty in the way that he discussed it, and then that gets and that reinforces like this conflation and confusion that we've had ever since, and it works particularly nicely for the PO or for the professional and managerial strata of the people of color populations, right? POC, PMC just has a nice ring, right? Because of the slippage, right, between first person singular and first person plural that this discourse depends on and enables. And it's like, who could ask for a better hustle, basically, right? Because what that means is that class skewed benefits, right, that are distributed in a class skewed way count for everybody, right, who identifies with that group. And now this is jumping probably farther ahead than we want to at this point, I don't know. But you fast forward to 2015 and 2016, right, when working class is like no longer just this beefy guy, but working class itself becomes a literal racial category in the minds of the woke left. Although Walter Benn Michaels says properly we shouldn't be using woke anymore because it belongs to the right at this point. But so I'll call it the MSNBC left, right? Since there's a picture that comes into my mind when I say it and hear it. That by the time 2016 comes, if you make a reference to a working class political program, then the immediate response from anti-racist activists is the accusation that invoking the working class is just a backhanded way to curry favor with white racists. So then all of a sudden, blacks and Hispanics and other non-whites, all of whom are disproportionately part of the working class, no longer get to be part of it. And then therefore, what they're really concerned about is the police killing. And yeah, everybody's concerned about police killing, except the police who kill. And closing the wealth gap.
Well, and moralism is a big part of the story too, right? I mean, moralism,
right, absolutely.
How we talk about poverty, and contemporaneously with the sort of culturalist turn toward inequality as it pertains to poverty, we have a version of the same thing happening at, again, roughly the same time or at the same time about race too, right? So the fact that the caste framework, let's say, has come back now is an interesting commentary on this moment, because if you take this back to the Oliver Cox era, and explore Cox's work in relation to, let's say, his critiques of Gunnar Myrdal. And so Myrdal was one of the champions of kind of moralistic case against racism, right? And Oliver Cox, the black social scientist, pushed back against that. And what Cox was dismayed by is a tendency of Myrdal and a growing number of liberals to talk about racial inequality, again, it's kind of moralistic terms that were free of political economy. And Cox was very clear in context. And it's interesting how not only has he been not received the attention that he deserves, it's worse than that. There are people who essentially misrepresent the case that he made, because he certainly was alive to the realness of racism. But for him, much like the Field sisters and us, racism was an expression of class exploitation. He read Jim Crow through the lens of the exploitation of Blacks at the hands of Southern oligarchs. And that was a framework so racism, though, was bound up, it was inextricably linked to class, right? Class exploitation for Cox. And that was an expression of a sentiment that was quite, dominant in the 30s and 40s, right? Through World War II, anyway. You find many Blacks who made some version of that same case that, again, racism and racial inequality were expressions of class exploitation. And, obviously by the end of the 40s, that would change, right? And along with contemporaneously with the turn toward the culturalist understanding of poverty, two versions of the same thing.